last May, when I made a reservation to stay in Georgia for the month of February, it fulfilled several things on our retirement bucket list. Jeff wanted to be warm for at least 1 month in the winter. I wanted to visit Charleston in South Carolina and Savannah and Cumberland Island in Georgia. History and salt marsh ecology were my focus. It wasn't until 1 week before we were to leave that I watched a PBS video, The Cost of Inheritance. It is the best documentary that I have seen addressing the possibility of reparations to the descendants of the African men and women who were taken from their lives and families to serve as the enslaved workers who built America and helped create the wealth of the colonists. I was inspired to know and own my roots. The reasons that I didn't already understand my roots are complicated. I did know that my father was an 11th generation American. His family had some wealth and education was highly valued. My father graduated from Wesleyan University and was an editor of the New Haven Register when I was a very young child. We were financially comfortable. My connection to that legacy was broken when in 1958 my mother decided that it was necessary for our well-being for her to divorce my father. Though I was grateful to my mother for that brave decision, that decision also caused us to be disconnected from the chain of privilege and to lose contact with the side of the family, except for periodic visits with my father, who remarried 2 years later. The privilege that remained, though, was the knowledge that books and education were a path to a good life, though we lost the ability to pay for that education. Not surprisingly, I was a little bitter towards my father. I particularly loved my grandfather, and I never knew how he felt about our disconnect. I was thrilled to reconnect with him for a short while before he passed away. Fast forward to January 2024. I decided to finally read all the family history that my father had funneled my way in his later years. I had reconnected with my 2 cousins about 20 years ago, so I emailed them and I Googled like crazy. I had known that I had an ancestor that was supposedly a big deal in Atlanta during the Civil War, but I didn't have any interest before. It didn't seem like my history. Well, it turns out my great-great-grandfather was a very big deal. John Calvin Peck, a mechanical engineer, was a successful builder in Connecticut. He moved to Atlanta in 1858 to relieve his severe asthma. Business was good and his family enjoyed living in the South. I was glad to learn that he never enslaved anyone. However, he did produce some munitions for the Confederates as ordered to, and in 1862 he received the contract to build the Atlanta Arsenal. Keeping his northern views to himself, according to his unfinished autobiography, he was considered a loyal Confederate by his fellow Southerners. He did evacuate his family to Minnesota prior to the siege of Atlanta, along the way reportedly betraying the Confederates and sharing the arsenal blueprints with Union General George Thomas. Truly loving Atlanta and evidently knowing a lucrative business environment when he saw one, he immediately returned when the war ended. He became one of the chief contractors in the city during Reconstruction. The original Kimball House, the Atlanta State House, and many buildings of the Atlanta Cotton Exposition are attributed to him. Many of his ancestors were ministers of the Presbyterian Church, and in 1894, my great-great-grandfather joined, get this, the newly formed Unitarian Church in Atlanta. and was its president in 1907, 1 year before his death. He and I, me 128 years later, both served as president of our congregations while in the 7th decade of our lives. Yet I had never heard of Unitarian Universalism until 20 years ago. Now, of course, I had to add Atlanta to our Georgia itinerary. In Atlanta, we visited his mausoleum and the now UU Congregation of Atlanta. It is a thriving congregation of 500 people, a liberal beacon in a red state. I met with their historian, who is writing a book about the history of the Unitarian Universalist Church in Georgia, including my great-great-grandfather. In finding out about my great-great-grandfather, I also learned about my grandfather, who in the eulogy given by his minister was referred to as a liberal in the best sense of the word. A kind, hardworking man who was always willing to help, and a man who enjoyed the solitary pleasures of reading, listening to music, and gardening. A man whom I would have been happy to have had more of in my life. The questions that I didn't have answered by all this research are ones that I have had to make peace with, ones related to my father. I have had to accept him for who he was. I am glad we made a connection in his final years when I could visit him in a nursing home without his second family present, and we could talk one-on-one for the first time in my life. Unfortunately, he was already partly lost to Alzheimer's disease. Maybe that was for the best. We couldn't have changed the past, but I could feel that he did love me. I could see that we shared some similar interests. Wanting to write to explain our world, liking to make books, loving to walk and swim, wanting to visit and learn about historical sites. Mostly, I understood that I could feel very fondly towards him, even if it felt disloyal to my mother, and perhaps even to my stepfather, who ended up helping to raise 5 kids and loving them all. I have come to appreciate the similarities that I found I had with my father, and those that I had with my grandfather, and even with my great-great-grandfather. These similarities bring me comfort, and I hope I might have passed them down to my children. I also hope I have passed down this desire to do our best, and the knowledge that in understanding our past, we can face the future with open hearts.
Elizabeth, I'm going to respectfully relocate your great-grandfather. In February 1965, 400 unarmed people, nearly all black, were attacked by police in Marion, Alabama, as they demonstrated for voting rights. 26-year-old Jimmy Lee Jackson was killed. Despite their peacefulness, protesters were portrayed by the media as a mob of angry black men. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. and other clergy from the Southern Christian Leadership Council called on white allies from around the country, especially clergy, to attend another protest. They hoped white allies would help build broader sympathy for their cause. On March 7th, 600 marchers planned to go from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. Early on in their march, it seemed like it would be uninterrupted by the police until they got to the crown of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where they got their first glimpse of an army of police waiting for them on the other side. It was too late. There was no turning around, so they continued, afraid but committed. The police attack on the protesters, including UU minister James Reeb, was so violent that the day was immediately dubbed Bloody Sunday. Suddenly, in the news, the police were the ones being portrayed as the angry mob. Protesters continued to arrive from around the country. 2 days later, on March 9th, there was another, larger march. The police were there, but let the demonstrators pass, taunted, but unarmed. That night after dinner, Reverend Reeb and 2 other white UU ministers were attacked. Reverend Reeb got the worst of it, sustaining massive head injuries. It took 2 hours to get him to a hospital because no ambulance would take him. He arrived in a coma and died 2 days later. Protests erupted all over the country, attempts to shame Alabama into stopping the violence and finally allowing free and fair elections. On March 16th, Unitarian Universalist Viola Liuzzo took part in one of those protests. It was at Wayne State University in Detroit. She was so horrified by the violence and injustice, the pathos of the whole situation, that she left the kids with her husband, got into their Oldsmobile, and drove to Selma to help out with throngs of other protesters, peaceful citizens that Alabama officials labeled outside agitators. In the March 19th, 1965 issue of Life magazine, journalist Richard Stoley described the voting rights marchers. They came from everywhere. Clergymen, nuns, students, doctors, plain Americans, Negro and white, to place themselves beside Martin Luther King in the streets to stand against the police of Alabama in the name of human dignity. In all the turbulent history of civil rights, never has there been such a widespread reaction to the doctrine of white supremacy. As soon as she arrived, she volunteered to use her car to shuttle protesters to and from marches happening almost daily. On March 25th, Mrs. Liuzzo and Leroy Moten, a 19-year-old black man, dropped off the last of their passengers. They were stopped at a red light when 4 men, all KKK members, pulled up alongside them, screaming epithets. As Mrs. Liuzzo pulled away, they shot her twice in the head. Mr. Moten survived. George Leonard wrote in The Nation, hundreds of these people would drop whatever they were doing. That some of them would leave home without changing their clothes, borrow money, overdraw their checking accounts, board planes, buses, trains, cars, travel thousands of miles with no luggage, get speeding tickets, hitchhike, hire horse-drawn wagons, that these people, mostly unknown to one another, would move for a single purpose: to place themselves alongside the Negroes they had watched on television. The white people who showed up weren't just do-gooders. They weren't just trying to shame the governor and the legislators and the school boards and the mayors of Alabama. They were also waking up to the responsibilities that came with their status as white people. In current parlance, we'd call Viola Liuzzo and James Reeb woke. They were awakened, or at least in the process of awakening to their own privilege as people with white skin in 1960s America. They were awakening to the ways in which they benefited from white supremacy. They wanted to create change, to be part of a solution, not to be part of a problem. In the parlance of linguist George Lakoff, they were reframing their understanding of their social location. Their helplessness in an unjust system was being reframed as the power of allyship. Now, you may know George Lakoff from a bestseller he wrote 20 years ago called Don't Think of an Elephant. His premise was that when we're told not to think of something, we can't help but think about it. Just mentioning what we are not supposed to think about is, in fact, thinking about it. He introduced most Americans to the idea of framing. Framing is basically contextualizing an idea, but contextualizing it in a way that benefits you. He said that when we see the world through a particular lens, if an idea doesn't fit within that frame of that lens, it just bounces off. It doesn't make sense. We don't see it. So to be able to set the framework of a worldview through language is to have power. Now, political conservatives, he argued, have been exemplars of framing in the public square. It started when Richard Nixon famously said, "I am not a crook." I was 6 and I remember that. What leaders in his party, especially then Governor of California, Ronald Reagan, understood immediately was that everyone immediately associated Nixon with being a crook because he said the word. So Republicans learned a lesson there, and they started reframing all of their arguments to sound more positive, hoping it would be more appealing to a broader audience. Now, you know what I mean, right? Tax cuts for the wealthiest became tax relief, and anti-queer legislation became family values. You know, political liberals have in the last 20 years become a little bit better at framing. And so conservatives have become better at reframing. So as liberals have embraced the idea of looking critically at our shared history of white supremacy, conservatives have reframed critical race theory as a conspiracy to shame them and have it banned from schools. They've made CRT a 4-letter word. When liberals talk about being woke as a process of personal growth, conservatives frame wokeness or reframe wokeness as limitations of their freedom of speech. The governor of Florida has referred to his state as the place where wokeness goes to die. They've made wokeness into a boogeyman. So conservatives have made a whole new frame that limits how their constituents take in information. And of course, that's exactly how frames, real physical frames, work. Like Elizabeth Wonderful paintings here, frames contain the subject and give structure and definition to them. The thing I love about these paintings, though, is that they invite us into the paintings. The empty spaces within the frames invite us to share a personal, intimate space with the subject. After hearing the angst of Frida Kahlo's breaking from her husband, we can join her inside that frame and feel her pain, the way marchers did when they went to Selma. You know, with Frida getting in that frame, it won't change the story or make it any less painful for her, but it changes us. It makes us more compassionate, more open-hearted, hopefully stronger and with broader vision. Joining one another within a framework allows us to not only hear a story like Elizabeth's, her story of her journey toward understanding the struggles and the intergenerational connections of her family, that joining within frames encourages us to embark on our own journeys of awakening. And those journeys of awakening, becoming woke, can help us forge a more just, inclusive, equitable future, transforming oppression into reparations, whatever that may look like. You know, up until just a few years ago, with the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, we UUs, especially white UUs, tended to think of James Reeb and Viola Liuzzo as UU martyrs, the white saviors who brought legitimacy and empathy to the civil rights movement, as if the work of Reverend King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference would never have taken off without them. Now, with the distance of time and a good deal of collective self-reflection and being called out on our assumptions, we've changed the framework. We've reframed how we think about the two of them. Now, we know that yes, James Reeb and Leoza were martyrs in the sense that they were killed in service of their belief, but they were not saviors. They were simply reframing their understanding for themselves and answering the call to take responsibility for making justice out of oppression. They put themselves in the framework of a community that needed them. And what they found was their shared humanity, a family they hadn't previously known. Please rise now, if you can, and open your great hymnals to number 298, Wake Now My Senses.